Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to 1994. We're already 5 years into the 90s. We're halfway through, can you believe it? It feels like it's gone by very fast. As we've been hitting each of these challenging years, I would say since even 1991, where I personally have been struggling to put together my list of 20 because there's just so many amazing, impactful albums that are coming out year by year. 1994 is no different, and I'm sure as we continue through the 90s, it's going to continue to be an ever-increasing challenge for me. So let's get going with it, shall we? Before we actually get started, though, just as a reminder, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I discuss here in today's episode, or the full albums that I discuss today, or my conspicuous absences, or any of the other music that I decided to keep for 1994, you can feel free to check out the links to both my Essential playlist and my Big playlist for this year, both linked in the description of this episode. So, what are we going to talk about today? As always, we're going to talk about what's happening right now by genre in 1994. Next, we're going to talk about my Essential albums for this year and why, and then my conspicuous absences from my Essential list this year and why. So before we get going, I just wanted to call out something that I have noticed the last 2 times I've done this project, and then it came back up again as I was doing this podcast episode for 1994, that for whatever reason, and I'm not totally sure of the context, because again, I'm mostly just listening to this music with no further research going into it, but in 1994, we start to see an interesting trend that will continue to progressively pop up over the next few years, in which the song Walk On By is referenced and utilized as a backbeat for all sorts of artists, be they in the rap, hip-hop space, trip-hop space, R&B space. I'm not 100% sure why this happens, but it is a common theme, and as we experience it, I will call it out, because guess what? In 1994, there's 2 examples of artists totally different from one another using Walk On By as part of their backbeat. Very strange. Not sure why it's happening. But having said that, let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now in the world of music by genre in 1994. So, for rap, Wu-Tang Clan has officially started to consume the entirety of the East Coast, with the exception of a few artists here and there like Nas or Biggie, which happened in 1994. Wu-Tang Clan as a brand has started to stretch out and consume the entirety of the East Coast sound and approach. And we start to see that a little bit this year. I don't think we have any examples specifically for this year. There are a couple on my big list, but next year it's going to be even more so the Wu-Tang Clan show. As I said, Biggie starts out this year, as does Nas, so that's the other side of the East Coast rap experience for gangster rap. Also, this year, Southern rap starts to get into the spotlight, which is really great, specifically Atlanta. I'm really excited for us to talk about the example that we have in which we're ushering in Southern rap, because it's one of my favorite bands anyway. You probably can suss out who I'm talking about based upon the year and the context, but in case you don't know, we'll talk about it when we get to our essentials. For folk music, it's really just continuing to merge with avant-garde to make avant-folk. Rock and pop right now on the way towards becoming officially indie pop and indie rock music of the late 90s and early 2000s. So folk is really the idea that brings us there, merging with these other ideas. So we're inching ever closer. I would say that give it another year or two and we're just going to be calling out indie pop and indie rock and not avant folk or folk, neo folk rock or folk pop or anything like that. It's just going to be indie pop and rock. Next, reggae. From a quality standpoint, it's pretty quiet this year. There's still great stuff that's coming out, but we're not necessarily having it bubble up to the essentials this year. Dancehall reggae in the style of Shabba Ranks is still very much where things are going in the scene of reggae. Obviously, reggae's roots are never going to leave them entirely, so there are plenty of artists out there of great quality that are putting out just straight ahead reggae. That's not necessarily the newer style of the rap slash dancehall toasting style of reggae that Shabba Ranks is making very popular right now. So not too much this year, probably next year though. Electronica, techno and trance are becoming much more popish, much more accessible to your average consumer. But at the same time, there's a lane that's moving away from the popish side on the techno and trance sides that is going even deeper, darker, more underground than it was before. And so that's really how you start to get that distinction between intellectual dance music and electronic dance music. So IDM, EDM, they really start to separate themselves even more so this year because the popishness of techno and trance is just ramping up even more so. So that alternative, just by association, starts to distance itself even more so from that pop idea. House is pretty quiet at this point. The only real shape that it's taking is if it's in association, R&B artists, avant-garde artists. So if you want to think about Seal, for example, he does a lot of house music, or Bjork. She does house-inspired avant electronica. So that's the more purist ways that house is entering into things. But for the most part, house is just living kind of in remix hell, where the only real way that house is finding its way into people's lives is if popular songs that aren't electronica are getting remixed with a house angle to them, which is a sad way to utilize house, but is definitely the way that things are going. So we'll continue to see some house pop up here and there over the next few years, but for the most part, it's mostly retreated back to the club at this point. And then drum and bass really hits this year. So we've been talking about drum and bass for the past couple of years, where breakbeats and trance and trip hop have been utilizing little markers here and there of drum and bass. Drum and bass actually comes into its own this year, but it's going to continue to explode and get much bigger over the next couple of years. But this year's where it really starts. Rock music, third wave alt rock is finally finding a path forward, I think. It's linking itself up with a couple ideas, both retro and new, in order to keep moving the genre forward towards the inevitability that is indie rock music. So we'll talk more about that when we get to our essentials. Retro roots rock, a la Pearl Jam, is doing some really interesting things this year, finally aligning itself with some degree of alternative rock music to create this neo-roots rock movement. So again, we'll talk about that because there's a couple different examples this year to highlight what we mean when we get to our essentials. Grunge continues to evolve in both popish directions and darker directions. So much like with electronica and techno and trance, creating these two distinctive paths where one side is becoming more of a pop accessible side. It's not going to be straight ahead pop music ever, but it's definitely becoming more and more accessible to a wider audience on one side, and then becoming, I would say, less accessible or more underground or more focused on a tight group of listeners and fan base in a darker, grimier place. So it's going in two different directions. And then Brit rock is continuing to grow again this year. I'm not necessarily sure if we have specific examples, but much like what Blur ushered in a year or two ago, we're continuing in that trend, and we're going to start to see ever increasing amounts of neo Brit rock over the next few years. On the metal side, grunge is mostly still controlling this genre, so there's not really a lot that's distinctly metal this year. We have one example that straddles both grunge and metal on the essentials for 1994, but for the most part, it's really just being obscured by grunge, having taken so many of its bits and pieces that finding a distinctive identity in metal right now is pretty hard. On the punk side, pop punk actually explodes this year, both in the East and the West. There's two distinctive examples, one on each end of the world, that really brings pop punk into this new era that we're going to be experiencing even until this day, which is really exciting. At the same time, considering that pop punk is becoming this big important force in the world of punk music, what I'm calling a neo-punk or latest iteration hardcore punk alternative or alternative punk, whatever you want to consider it to be, emerging as a complement to pop punk that is a little bit more focused on the roots and traditions of punk music. It's still accessible like pop punk music is, but it definitely seems like it's connecting back to older iterations of punk music to bring it forward today. So that's why I call it neo-punk. Country, from a quality perspective, is pretty quiet. There's not a lot going on here. I'm sure that there is a lot of country that's flying beneath our quality radar right now that we're not regarding in any respect because it's 1994 at this point. I'm sure we're missing something around Clint Black continues to make music, Travis Tritt continues to make music, Garth Brooks I'm sure is happening by this point, and we're not regarding any of that at all because the quality of the albums, if it even made it to my big list to begin with, my original big list before I cut it down based upon what I liked and what I thought was important, it's not on my big list now, so I'm not regarding it at this point, but I'm sure it's happening. But at least for us, for the purposes of this podcast, not much is happening. I'm sure alt country will find its way back to us soon because there's a huge part of indie rock in the late 90s, 2000s that does elicit alt country artifacts. So I'm sure alt country will find its way back to us very soon in a meaningful way. On the R&B side, girl groups and boy bands are growing even more so than they have been before. We've got a few examples this year, which is a huge spring up from how many we've been experiencing previously, be it 1 or 0. So there's more than just Boys to Men this year, so there's a lot more to talk about here. What I will call out is that the quality is still very spotty and inconsistent across these groups. So there's some higher quality boy bands and girl groups. There's some low quality girl groups and boy bands. So the front runners, the ones that are the most prominent though, and the strongest, they have the quality and they're finding their stride though. But I think as a whole, the entire R&B approach to girl groups and boy bands is still finding its direction. I think that it's almost there in terms of finding its identity, but it's not quite there yet, but it's almost there. So we'll keep seeing this same trend of girl groups and boy bands from the R&B side continuing to evolve over the next year or two before inevitably it's co-opted by straight ahead pop culture, and then the R&B side will start to slough off, unfortunately, in favor of just banal pop music. And to that end, pop music, quality pop is essentially marching from dream pop right into indie pop music by utilizing folk artifacts, either retro or neo. So indie pop is almost here. I would give it another year and then we'll probably be right on the shores of indie pop. And as I said a minute ago about the co-opting of R&B music, fortunately, unfortunately, we're nearing another moment in music history in which white culture is going to co-opt R&B conventions and take over the entirety of the girl group boy band scene, leaving scraps for Black culture or just lovers of R&B music and its history and its conventions, that being the focus of the girl group boy band music and dynamics, or going in the direction of, like I said, pop white culture taking over a lot of these artifacts and making it their own, a la Elvis, right? Because back in the day, there was rock and roll music that was happening well before Elvis. And then Elvis came on the scene and like everything changed, right? We're venturing into that moment again. Fortunately, unfortunately, depending on your perspective. But because of that, it's for a bit of time going to meaningfully impact the quality of the boy band girl group music that we're experiencing. Like I think Backstreet Boys is maybe a year or two away from us, maybe 3 years. It's really close to us. And so that's going to usher in that totally new era of taking a lot of those R&B conventions, barbershop doo-wop conventions, Motown conventions that have been getting played with girl groups and boy bands for the last few years and turn it into this kind of banal thing. It's not necessarily a judgment call. It's more just to say that that's the direction that the music goes in order to become more accessible to a wider audience. And that's just generally the direction that it goes. So it might be happening and taking place outside of our sphere of quality that we tend to operate in with our big list and our essential list. But if ones do pop up, we'll make sure to call them out where we can. On the avant-garde side, mostly just associating with other avenues, like I said earlier about electronica, in some cases pop, rock, folk. We say avant folk, avant rock, avant electronica, avant pop. All these things are happening at the same time. So really there's a very limited amount of avant-garde music that's happening that's not associated with something else like electronica or pop music that's ushering in a new thing. Like avant-garde pop is eventually going to become something like indie pop, or avant-garde electronica is going to become something that Bjork utilizes that's her distinctive sound, or avant folk, for example. So avant-garde straight ahead. There's not too much of it going on in our awareness right now, but as it happens, we'll call it out because it's almost always at the forefront of what's happening with most of these other genres. For video game music, second-gen video game music ambition is continuing to rise in composers and sound engineers, and they're really at this point just trying to get every conceivable thing they can out of the technology that's available to them, and they're really butting up against the limitations at this point. I would say that we're in a late-stage trend here with second-gen video game music, where we're hitting some of the best music that you're going to hear from this generation. But at the same time, we're getting ever closer to that plateau of just the quality can't progress any further, no matter how ingenious or crafty you are with the engineering or the sound effects or anything like that. So we are hitting that asymptote. And at the same time, we're in a period where third gen has started with Sega Saturn at the very least. Sony PlayStation is coming out next year, as is the Sega Dreamcast, that's right on the way, and the Nintendo 64. So third gen is essentially here, but nothing that is getting made right now from a video game music perspective is of great quality because composers and sound engineers are still trying to figure out what do they do with this technology in order to make it interesting and engaging and meaningful from a music perspective for the players. So we're in this lull period of we're hitting a maximum limit on second gen and third gen isn't there yet. So we're in that gray period right now. On the J-pop side, as I said, when it comes to punk, there is a really meaningful album this year that starts to set a new tone in rock music going forward. Obviously, for the last couple of years, we've been talking about stuff like Castella or Bucktick. So the J-rock side is continuing to thrive. There's also a very large alt-rock scene in Japan that has been putting out some pretty good quality stuff. It's not astounding by any means, especially compared to Western alternative rock music or indie rock music of any kind, but the quality is ever increasing. So because of that, we are going to eventually hit a point at which a lot of J-rock is starting to disperse and diffuse like has happened in Western society, where it's not just generic rock music. It's metal, it's rock, it's punk, it's folk rock, electronica rock. All of those different diffusions will continue to happen in Japan too, and we will start to get much more specific in quality sounds that are coming out. On the pop side though, again, it's really still pretty banal. Like, there's been a couple bands that have been putting out meaningful music the last 4 or 5 years that we're not regarding, like Dreams Come True, for example. But again, it's not rising to the level that we're talking about it here. I honestly do perceive that when Size left the stage, there just wasn't anybody that really picked up the mantle from a J-pop perspective, maybe in a year or two. But fortunately, like I said, with this year, this one record that we're going to talk about in the Essentials does bring about some new life. So I'm excited to talk about it. And on the K-pop side, finally, we're still just swirling a ton, trying to figure out what we can do with the Sotaji sound that he put out in his first album, to include Sotaji himself. Still not totally figuring out what he wants to do just yet, or how to take what he's come up with and move it forward. I'd also like to believe that with the additional evolutions and influences from R&B, both on the group side and the solo side, K-pop will continue to accumulate and utilize some of those Western artifacts to boost up and give better creative ideas to their artists in Korea in order to usher in a new era of K-pop. We're not totally there yet, and probably won't be there for maybe even the rest of the decade. But if we have a record pop up here and there that's really great, we'll absolutely call it out. But for the most part, Sotaji, his first album was so early in the process that it took many, many years of not just K-pop evolution, but also Western R&B pop music to evolve and rap music to evolve for those artifacts to come about that K-pop could then co-opt and utilize in order to evolve their own genre. So we still have time on that. Okay, so let's talk about our essential albums next and why. First is For Hero with a 4, number 4. Reinforced presents For Hero Parallel Universe. This is trip hop, but mostly drum and bass. So we talked a minute ago in the electronica section about how drum and bass comes into its own this year. It does here in this album. There are a couple other examples in which drum and bass is getting played with a little bit, but Parallel Universe is the best, biggest, clearest example of drum and bass officially coming into its own. So the tracks I'm going to call out: Universal Love, No Imitation, Parallel Universe the track, and Talk Around Town. So in this record, you could very much see how each of these tracks, you can hear the percussive influence that I talked about last year around drum and bass right here. And all 4 tracks are doing the same thing. And if you listen to the rest of this record, it's a lot of drum and bass with a little bit of trip hop. I would say it's like 80% drum and bass, 20% trip hop throughout. Like, you've got the haunting vocals, you've got the jazz infused melodies and rhythms, but then it's a lot of percussion, drum and bass. So you can really hear in this record the continued separation between trip hop and break beats and drum and bass. And I guarantee you in the next year or two, drum and bass is going to become even more of its own thing. So that 80-20 split is going to turn into like 5 and 95%. So it's going to continue to go in that direction. For Hero is actually quite on the forefront, and they continue to be at the forefront for the next year or two. So if you like these 4 tracks and like what they're doing here, this is what drum and bass approximately is. So if you like where this is going, until it evolves next, maybe in 4 years, this is approximately what it's going to be. So if you like it, keep going with it. The whole record's like this. Next is All for One with a 4. Again, All for One, also with a 4. This is R&B boy band music. And the only track I'm going to call out is I Swear, which is their hit. It was the song that was all over the radio for them. I'm sure that there was a ton of people that mistook them for Boyz II Men. It makes sense. It wasn't. It was All for One. They are probably that in-betweener period of transitioning away from being strictly R&B boy band to just being a pop boy band, because I Swear, talking about percentages, it's like 70-30 pop and R&B. It barely sounds like what you would imagine R&B to sound like. It mostly sounds like what Backstreet Boys or NSYNC or 98 Degrees or any of those boy bands in the later iteration of boy bands sounds like. So here's what I'll say about this album. Despite the fact that it is directionally very important, because I Swear was a clear indicator to artists that were looking to get into this field, production companies that were interested in making money off of some of this music. They heard I Swear and realized that they could just do this, but whole albums of it, whole personas of bands about it. And so directionally, this album is very important. Having said that, though, this album is actually not very good quality-wise. I Swear, the melodies, the harmonies fluctuate wildly in terms of being in tune and out of tune. And not in a Pavement sort of I did it on purpose, I don't really care about singing correctly sort of way. To me, I Swear is probably the only track on this album that sounds as much in tune as the rest of the album does. The rest of the album fluctuates even more so than this does. It's actually kind of amazing that this record got made at all. And you might be thinking to yourself, SJ, why were you putting a record that isn't very good on this list? And I'll say, first of all, clearly AllMusic directed me towards this record because it got at least 4.5 or 5 stars in order for me to have even considered putting it on my big list to begin with. And then when I listened to it, I must have made the same conclusion that I Swear is very important, but maybe the rest of the record isn't very important. And then when I was going through and making this podcast, it was the same thing. I Swear is an incredibly impactful, meaningful track in the history of pop music, R&B boy band music, pop boy band music, the whole history. I Swear is foundational and critical. The rest of the album is not very good though. So it's so important that it makes not putting it on a conspicuous absence and putting it on the essentials important. So take that for what you will. But having said that, if you like I Swear and you want to venture into the rest of the album and see if you like it, or you are a huge All For One fan and we finally got to All For One for you so you can go enjoy the record at your leisure, go ahead and do it. I tend to be a stickler when it comes to being in tune, and I tend to have a high sensitivity to whether or not the singers are pitchy on accident, and so that kind of hits me in a really bad way. But I honor the importance that I Swear has, but this record isn't for me. But if it's for you, great, listen to the rest of it. It is quality boy band music insofar as it brings all of the artifacts and markers. So if you really like reveling in that, go for it. All For One might be for you. So next is Boyz II Men with a Roman numeral 2. It seems like nobody can actually use the thing that they're supposed to use in this case. And the album is 2, again, Roman numerals. This is R&B boy band music too. Far better quality than All For One though. It's a little bit hard to put All For One and Boyz II Men in the same conversation, in the same genre bracket, because Boyz II Men is far further out ahead in the evolution. Their quality is way, way further along. Their harmonies are great. Their melodies are great. Their pop hooks are great. First of all, let me call out the track. So Thank You, huge hit. I'll Make Love to You, monster hit. On Bended Knee, another monster hit. And Water Runs Dry, another great hit. So this one has a ton of their greatest hits on this record. It's clear that they accumulated an insane amount of confidence and perspective from their last record, Cooley High Harmony, which was also on our essentials. This is even more so. Like the barbershop is so there, the doo-wop there, Motown there. They are leaning so much into their R&B roots here that the quality is just so palpable, and it's very heartening to listen to that they are really figuring out a way to mobilize retro R&B conventions into this modern style that totally works. Where previously in Cooley High Harmony, there was a little bit more New Jack swing to it. There's less so here and more just focused on those older, more retro genres and just bringing those forward to modern day conception. It's really cool stuff. The last thing I'll say about this record, other than the fact that it's wildly famous and even more so put them on the map than they ever have before, is that the world is clearly watching Boyz II Men. Not just in connection to the record companies that are interested in trying to make money off of this sound, other artists like Backstreet Boys or any other potential boy bands that are right on the horizon waiting to jump out and make some money here and put their name out there. But also, like I said, K-pop and boy band conceptions also in Japan and all across Asia, and also in the UK and in Western Europe, like all across the world. Every major continent is looking at Boyz II Men's model and trying to figure out how do we replicate this idea in our own localities, in our own culture, so that we could be making this kind of money and maybe even more so too. Because if you take Thank You, I'll Make Love to You, On Bended Knee, Water Runs Dry, and then anything that they did in their previous album and just genericize it even more, add even more pop hooks to it, unfortunately whitewash a whole bunch of this stuff, or take specifically the black culture out of it and put different populations of people in it to tap into particular demographics, you're going to make all sorts of money mobilizing this idea. And guess what? They do. That's what happens with boy bands from 94, 93 until today. It continues to happen. And not just in K-pop, it's all over the world. So it's really clear too that what they were doing in this moment, I wonder if they realized in this moment how unbelievably influential this record was going to be to springboard eons and eons and eons and just billions of dollars in revenue for countless companies, countless people, countless industries just by records like this, showing the world that this was possible and that you could make this happen for yourself. It's really amazing stuff. If you like these 4 tracks, give the rest a listen because it's all about like this. I think I pulled out the 4 most important and meaningful tracks, but if you like what's going on here and you haven't listened to 2 for a while, give it a listen because it's really great stuff. Boys to Men, totally influential, and they made all the waves in order to make today happen for us. So let's give them our love. Next is Bush, 16 Stone. This is neo roots rock and grunge rock. So remember how we were talking in the rock section about we're walking away from retro roots rock and we're talking more about neo roots rock. And the way that we're getting there, not just with grunge rock, is by incorporating first wave alternative rock. So Husker Du, which we haven't really talked about and referenced meaningfully except on our conspicuous absences back in the 80s. Those ideas that they were playing with in the late 80s that didn't seem like had a meaningful connection point to a later stage of alt rock finally finds its footing. And also because of that, it's officially starting to better define itself as alternative rock, where people have been calling it alt rock since 10 and maybe a little bit before by Pearl Jam, but now it actually is incorporating some alt rock conventions, so maybe people can effectively call it alt rock. I still want to make sure that I'm distinguishing though between what we consider here to be alternative rock so that we don't mix things up. So I'm going to keep calling it neo roots rock just because it's clearly not Pavement, it's clearly not Sonic Youth, it's not Dinosaur Jr., it's its own thing. It does have ties back to roots rock back from the 70s, except this new conception integrating Husker Du ideas and grunge ideas. So that's how we're going to keep talking about it going forward. So the tracks I'm going to call out: Everything Zen, huge hit for them; Come Down, big hit; Machine Head, big hit; and Glycerin, or Glycerine, depending on how you're pronouncing it, which is probably their biggest hit to this moment. As I said before, this is grunge rock, it's neo roots rock, so we're taking Pearl Jam and Nevermind from Nirvana, and not Bleach or In Utero, which is much more traditional alt rock, but Nevermind by Nirvana and any bit of Pearl Jam, and shoving it together and evolving it further. What I would say too is that grunge in this case is pushing it out of being as retro as it has been, in addition to that first wave alt rock in Husker Du. So it's got the sound of Eddie Vedder, right? Because for whatever reason, there was this desire to really sound like Eddie Vedder in this moment, which we're not going to give people a hard time about it, because what happens is that record companies want to find somebody that sounds like Eddie Vedder in this case and puts them on a platform. And so it's not necessarily that Gavin Rossdale is actively trying to sound like Eddie Vedder on purpose so that they can get a record. It's probably the other direction, that he just happens to sound like Eddie Vedder, and a record company was looking for somebody that sounds like Eddie Vedder and gave Bush a platform. So Gavin Rossdale is an amazing singer. This whole record is great. I think he does an excellent job of eliciting further emotions than Eddie Vedder does. So this is one of my favorite records of the year. Everything Zen is one of my favorite songs. It's so great. And if you like Everything Zen, Come Down, Machine Head, Glycerine, go ahead with the rest of it because it all basically sounds like this. So if you're a big Bush fan, we're at 16 Stone already. Can you believe it? We're in 1994. We made it. If you're not familiar with Bush or 16 Stone, they're British, so it's a little bit of a different angle, but for the most part, it's going in that same direction that 10 was. It's just evolving a little bit because it's adding more grunge into it, like Nevermind. So it's evolved, but for the most part, it's just about like this. So give it a listen if you haven't listened to it for a while, or if you've never heard Bush or 16 Stone. It's great stuff. Next is Daniel Johnston, Fun. This is avant-garde indie pop. I'm just going to call it indie pop. Like, it could be avant pop, it could be avant-garde pop, but at this point, so much of what he's doing on this record is classified in later years as indie pop that we're just calling it that so we can get out in front of it. The tracks Love Wheel, Life in Vain, Happy Time, all three of them basically sound like late 90s, early 2000s indie pop. It's got his marker on it. So if you remember back Daniel Johnston, when we talked about him in 1983, so 11 years ago. This is basically just that, except you can hear it a little bit better because it's a little less avant-garde than it was before, and he wasn't talking into, let's just say, a kid's Casio microphone. Interestingly enough about Daniel Johnston, before I talk a little bit more about the indie pop leanings, is that one thing we haven't talked about regarding him is that so many bands that are wildly popular, to include Nirvana, have referenced Daniel Johnston's affectations as inspiring them. So you can hear some of his affectations a little bit more clearly in this record than his record back in 1983. And so you can detect a little bit more of those affectations, the like deep emotions and the anxiety and the worry and the paranoia that's harkening back to post-punk moments. But he's carrying that forward and just seeming more like that uncertain indie pop artist that is so caricaturistic in the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's amazing that he is taking a decade-old idea back from post-punk, carrying it forward, utilizing avant-garde aspects like his way of playing the music and making it seem very kitschy, and it hitting indie pop places in our mind. It's an amazing thing that he's doing, bringing all this forward and yet somehow managing to inspire people across genres wildly different from one another along the way. Daniel Johnston, he was an amazing artist, an absolute treasure, and I hope that we can continue to just give him as much love as we can just because of how influential he is, was, has been, will be, etc. So if you like these 3 tracks, the rest of it's about like this. I think I pulled out the 3 best examples of what he's going for here in this album. So some of these other ones might not hit it as clearly and as effectively, but if you like it, give it a shot. Listen to another track and then another track and then another and see how much we're really getting the fun out of fun. So next is Green Day, Dookie. Do I even have to say that this is West Coast pop punk music? Maybe. For those that aren't familiar with Green Day, this is West Coast pop punk music. Dookie is their first major album. We've been waiting to talk about Green Day's Dookie for several years, I think, at this point, because much like Nirvana's Nevermind, it was one of the original things in my head that I had about this project of how did we get from 1980 to Green Day? How did that happen? Well, we're here. This is another at least big milestone for me and my project that we've arrived at Dookie, and I could say pretty unequivocally how we get here, and we'll talk about it here in a second. But before that, let's talk about the tracks. I called out only 4 here because I know that 4 is basically my maximum. So this is to say that when I'm calling out these 4, this is not the only ones that I recommend because I purely recommend listening to this entire album end to end in one sitting every time because it's pretty accessible and every track is great. So I don't really see a point in not just listening to the whole thing. But in case you want very specific tracks to get you started, in case you're not familiar with Green Day, Dookie, or West Coast pop punk music from the early 90s, here it is. Having a Blast, Long View, Welcome to Paradise, and Basket Case. All 4 of these are some of their greatest hits that they've ever had, but there's plenty of other tracks that I don't call out, like the first track in the album, Burnout, one of the best tracks. It very effectively introduces you to exactly who they are in about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and then you just roll right into Having a Blast, and then you're off to the races with Green Day and Dookie. Here's what I'll say about this record, other than what I've already said. So you can clearly tell by how I'm talking about this record that I have a very biased perspective that this record is amazing. This is a clear evolution off of many different aspects of the punk movement, to include even the lackadaisical side of Landshark from Fang. There's even pieces of that in here too. There's a lot of Clash in here, obviously. There's a lot of Bad Religion in here. There's a lot of Social Distortion in here. And then there's also other little artifacts from individual little punk moments or metal moments or rock moments that they infuse in here. The other piece that I will say about this though too, which is why it's pop punk versus just neo-punk or just regular West Coast punk, is that they take, I believe, a lot of reference back to retro rock and roll movements. Let's even just say the Beatles, for example. All of these tracks are edited impeccably. Like you get into a song, it happens, and then it's over right before you start to get sick of it, which is very much akin to the Beatles, that you get into a song, it's happening, you hit a couple verses, and then you're out, right? So much like Paul McCartney, in terms of songwriting, getting in and getting out smoothly, seamlessly, and all of these songs sounding distinctive from one another, they're hitting all of that. And we will be able to go further into the deep analyses of Green Day as we move into their later albums and also when they get into their side projects and really get to see further where their influences are from. But I can tell you, at least just listening to this music in this moment, so we're not spoiling things, is it's clear that it's a combination of old school rock and roll music like the Beatles mixed with punk music like Bad Religion. And this is what you get. It's probably the most accessible punk music that does exist outside of being so pop punk. It's like the Go-Go's, like it's more pop than it is punk. This is still very much punk, but there's just enough pop infused into it to make it just about the most accessible punk music that you can ever possibly find up until this moment in 1994. It's amazing stuff. Like I said, I only listened to this album end to end. I really don't pick out individual tracks. That's just me. I've listened to this album 100,000 million times. This year that I'm doing this, I got my Wrapped from Spotify, and this was the album that I listened to the most. So no surprise there. It's funny, it's not like my favorite album. Green Day isn't necessarily my favorite band. This isn't my favorite album, but if I'm sitting down and I just want to enjoy some music, I can always go back to this record and just listen to the whole actual thing and get something out of it that maybe I didn't get out of it before, or I'm just reveling in how much I enjoyed it. The funny thing I'll say before I close out here is, when this record came out in 1994, I hated it. I hated this album. I hated everything it represented. I disliked how infused into pop culture it was, and it just annoyed me to no end. Every time it was on the radio, I turned it off. Every time it was in a movie, I completely disengaged. I hated this album. And Green Day by extension. But the funny thing is that as an adult, I've learned to appreciate it even more so and just honor it for what it is. And it is really great. I think I probably disliked it just because it was so popular and so everywhere in 1994, 5, 6, that it just completely wore out its welcome for me. So it's unfortunate, but I think I've reconciled at this point. So if you like these 4 tracks, give the rest a listen because it's all pretty impeccably crafted just like this. So why not give it a shot? If you haven't listened to Dookie for a while or you've never listened to it, give it a nice long listen because it's really amazing stuff. And the storytelling is really fantastic too. So give that your time as well. So next is Hootie and the Blowfish, Cracked Rear View. This is just neo-roots rock. There's not really a lot of grunge rock going on. So Hootie and the Blowfish and Dave Matthews Band are very close to each other in time and space for me in my personal music history. So I often have to work hard in my mind to really separate the two out. Obviously, as they go along, they become much more distinctive from one another. But right now, there's like a 10% piece that they share between them in their Venn diagram that often really conflates because they have, again, Eddie Vedder-esque style singing, kind of like Bush, like they all sort of have that sound that they're all co-opting at once. Hootie and the Blowfish, though, is distinctive and is on the essential list because they infuse a lot more R&B melodies and harmonies into their music, so that makes the roots rock components complemented a little bit more rather than just going right for the retro roots ideas and infusing a little bit of that alternative rock into it. To me, this is just a really awesome evolution off of Pearl Jam. I don't really recall in my mind how much of an influence Hootie and the Blowfish has on later stage rock music, just because I don't remember. So I'm excited for us to go on that journey together because this is one of my favorite records from this year. The tracks Hannah Jane, Hold My Hand, Let Her Cry, and Only Want to Be With You. All 4 of them are really great tracks. They're all very distinctive from one another. They all show the influences from R&B throughout. The harmonies and the melodies are so great. Hootie is just such a great emotive singer that takes the Pearl Jam, the Eddie Vedder ideas and just pushes them into this new heartfelt place that doesn't sound like pop. It sounds more like that rock element, so it's less like Dave Matthews Band. And it's always just comes in deep with the emotions and they hit you hard with them. And Hootie just does such a great job eliciting those emotions in how he sings. And so it's just a really fantastic album. Really love Hootie and the Blowfish. Cracked Rear View is such a great album. I mean, I love all 4 of these tracks and the rest of the album. So if you like what's going on here, the rest of it's about like this. I think it kind of hits the personas of all of these 4 tracks over and over again. I think I pulled out the 4 best ones, but keep going with it because this is a really great record. It's one of my favorites for the year. So next is Jeff Buckley, Grace. This is avant rock, certainly, and neo-psychedelic rock, definitely. For those that aren't familiar, Jeff Buckley is the son of Tim Buckley, who was the center point of King Crimson back from the 60s and 70s. So when you listen to the tracks Grace the Track, Lilac Wine, So Real, and Hallelujah, Hallelujah, not so much. That's definitely Jeff Buckley's own thing. But those first 3 tracks really sounds like King Crimson a lot. Grace definitely does, and Lilac Wine and So Real to a lesser extent, but Grace really does. So I put one King Crimson album, which was Discipline, on my big list from the very early 80s. It wasn't a Conspicuous Absence and it wasn't on the Essentials, but it's buried in there. So if you want to go back and hear some 80s style King Crimson just to orient yourself on what Jeff Buckley is doing here, he's not doing this in a vacuum. He's very clearly hearkening back to his father, Tim Buckley, who had passed away long since by this time. And Jeff Buckley obviously passes away, I think at the same exact age that his father passed away, soon after Grace came out. So he's definitely referencing retro psychedelic rock a lot, very much so, in these tracks. But considering it's been 18 to 20 years, so 74 to 76 at this point, it kind of sounds like a whole new thing. But it's basically a retro idea that he's infusing into current stuff. But I'm sure at this point, there were a lot of people that were young, like I was in 1994, hearing Grace for the first time and thinking, wow, this is really out there stuff, because you just didn't have that level of music history. That's not to take away from Jeff Buckley's vision, because it is astounding to witness. Like Hallelujah, and all of the many times it's been covered, is one of the best tracks of the decade. So he had an untold amount of creativity welling up in him, and one could believe that it was the thing that put him in the ground, which is really sad. But he was an amazing talent at the time, and he had such a clear vision for what he wanted to accomplish, and it's sad that he only really got that one shot at it before he left us. But Grace is an amazing album, and the thing is, too, that it ushers in even more so those neo-psychedelic ideas that are going to get played with over the next year or two, like when Radiohead comes onto the scene. There's a lot in Grace, Lilac Wine, and So Real that sound like deep influences for bands like Radiohead, The Verve, and bands like that to continue to carry forward the torch that Jeff Buckley's putting out there to show that those retro psychedelic rock ideas, even from bands like King Crimson and space rock and things like that, can lean forward into a new young audience in 1994-95 and really connect with people. So he was out there making it happen, showing the value. And so for that, we honor him. If you like these 4 tracks, the rest is pretty out there in its own way. That's why it's more avant rock than just straight ahead neo-psychedelic rock. So if you like it, listen to the rest of it, because it's pretty varied in terms of what he tackles, because his creativity is undeniable, like we've said. So give the whole thing a listen if you're into it, because Grace is an amazing record. So next is Judy and Mary JAM. Jam. This is Japanese pop punk. I had talked at the very beginning of this episode about how there was both a Western world side of influencing and bringing about pop punk and an Eastern side. This is the Eastern side. So Jam, J-A-M, to me is very much a mirror of Dookie. So remember how over the entirety of this podcast so far, we have had these years that come along where we have 2 albums that come out that mirror one another, like when Prince and Michael Jackson came out with their albums in the same year, or like when Public Enemy and NWA came out with their albums in the same year, or when Smashing Pumpkins and Pearl Jam and Nirvana came out with their records in the same year. So this is another one of those instances in which Dookie and JAM came out in the same year. And the thing is that Dookie was a much bigger global hit, for sure. But I'd like to believe in Japan, JAM hit in a similar way that Dookie did in that moment, because Judy and Mary as a band is really great, and they similarly get into a song, make it happen, and then get out of there. It's not nearly as clean as Green Day is. It's like 80%, 85% there, but it's still very tight. 2, that Judy and Mary is, in this record, I think, mostly putting on a persona of punk. And in truth, they are mostly a J-pop band. But in this one record, and maybe a record or 2 after that, they're embodying a punk persona, but it's definitely still pop music, for sure. It's definitely still J-pop, but they've got a punk angle to it. So the tracks I'm going to call out: Judy the Tank Girl, Love Me Do, which, again, talking about the Beatles, Slapdash, and Power of Love. So all 4 of those tracks are a great introduction to Judy and Mary, because I would bet money that 99.9% of the people that are listening to this episode have never heard of Judy and Mary, have never heard of Yuki, who is the lead singer of Judy and Mary. But for those people, this is a great introduction to Judy and Mary. For those that are familiar with Judy and Mary, I think we all agree that these are the 4 tracks to listen to. They're the first 4 tracks on the album, and they're all really great and distinctive from one another. As I said before, this record breathes new life into the pop scene of Japan, where it's been a lot of banal J-pop music like we've been ignoring for the last 14 years at this point, almost 15 years, as part of this podcast, with the exception of a couple here and there. And it is a great, much more accessible bit of music compared to the Visual K coming out of Bucktick that might be a little bit too inaccessible for pop fans, or Costella, which is a little bit more punk than this, but definitely let JAM come into existence. Like the record that Costella did in 92 definitely led us to this moment. And you could even hear it in Power of Love is a good example. Later music from JAM will give you a better indication of just how influential bands like Costello were in making Judy and Mary on the punk side come into being. But you can hear just in these 4 tracks where those influences come from. The last thing I'll say before I move off of this and just let you go listen to the music, because all the rest of it's about like this, similar to Dookie, even if you don't know Japanese, listening to it, you get into these tracks, you get a flavor for them, and then they're over, and then you move into the next one, get a flavor, and they're over. So it is very consumable too, like Dookie is. So if you like what you're listening to here in these 4 tracks, give the rest a listen. It's all about as accessible as this is. So having said all that, the last thing I'll say is that the lead singer, Yuki, which I brought up a second ago, is one of my favorite singers in rock music ever. And I'll tell you the reason why, especially for those that haven't been really aggressively leaning into all the Japanese music that I've been putting on my big lists, or even listening intently to all the music that I've been giving you in my essential list that's on the Japanese side. First of all, Yuki has a very, very, very good voice. It has an insane amount of range that I don't even think gets fully highlighted in this record, nor in the other record that they came out with this year, which was Orange Sunshine, which is much more poppy than this. So if you want to go listen to Orange Sunshine and just hear more of the pop variety for them, like straight ahead, no punk, go listen to that too. It just gives you another flavor for where they're at. But Yuki, her vocal range is pretty crazy, and she just flings it around effortlessly, which is pretty amazing. Some of these tracks highlight how she can go from highs to lows pretty flawlessly and do it with such emotive or lackadaisical affectations that it just sounds totally effortless. It's amazing stuff. But also that her pronunciation of Japanese is so distinctive that, first of all, it sounds very punk, that she's making the Japanese sounds work for her in a way that makes it sound counterculture, which is really cool stuff. She is not committed to phrasing, affectations, sounds, intonation at all around typical pronunciation of Japanese words. She'll just play around with and mutilate the whole language if it serves her. And she is one of very, very, very few people up until this point, with the exception of probably some hardcore J-punk bands back in the 70s era of original J-punk that were doing this sort of thing. She is a distinctive individual, at least in 1994 and leading forward, that people don't really pronounce the Japanese as a singer like she does, which makes her very engaging and interesting to listen to. I would even encourage you, if you wanted to just go back and listen to literally any track that we highlighted by Henri or maybe even Size from the 80s, and then listen to Love Me Do even. But Slapdash is much more of that good example where you hear it and go, wow, that barely even sounds like Japanese at all. Her voice is very distinctive, and like I said, that pronunciation really pulls you in and makes you just listen to the sounds that are getting elicited out of her mouth. And it really does complement the music, which is also played pretty impeccably too. So this is a foundational album for me. This was one of the very early albums that I came upon myself organically and fell in love with. So I've been a Judy and Mary fan forever. And so being able to give it all to you in this moment is a gift. And so I hope you enjoy it. So next is Korn with a K. Korn with a K. I think everybody that's familiar with Korn knows that it's spelled with a K, but for those that are not familiar, it's spelled with a K. This is grunge, definitely, and thrash metal, definitely. And when I say thrash metal, I mean first iteration Metallica thrash metal. The tracks I'm going to call out, Ball Tongue, Need To, and Divine. This to me is basically if you take that first iteration speed metal, thrash metal idea of Metallica and put Pearl Jam with it, Eddie Vedder style Pearl Jam, retro roots rock, and grunge, and merge it all together and you get Korn, basically. There's also Rage Against the Machine elements here. There's Pantera elements, Nine Inch Nails. It's all basically led to this moment right here. The thing is, much like All For One, which is a funny comparison to make, Korn and All For One, both of these records are wildly influential. Like the Korn sound continues to permeate through thrash metal music for ages and ages and ages. I mean, Korn, Pantera, like that idea continues to navigate forward for thrash metal, heavy metal, grunge metal, all that stuff for at least the next decade or two. So wildly influential. But the quality of this album, again, not quite there. It's not nearly as subpar quality as the All For One record, because this is definitely better than that. But the guitar work, the drum work, like the instrumentation is pretty spotty. It's verging on subpar for some tracks. The singing is not always totally in tune, nor is it well syncopated with the music. So I can't imagine that this is like an alt rock on purpose affectation, that they're just not totally there in their quality. I'd like to believe that Korn does figure out a way in order to become even more confident and consistent with their quality, but in this moment, not so much. But those 3 tracks are so important and so influential in the history of metal music. It's hard to not put them on our essentials so that you can listen to them for your own education and get a really good sense for what's going on in 1994. So if you do like these 3 tracks, because I know that there's a whole bunch of Korn fans out there and there's a whole bunch of thrash metal fans out there that probably are going to firebomb my comment sections on Instagram and otherwise for saying the things that I said. But if you like these 3, go give the rest of it a try. Give the next track a try. Just give one other track a try. And if you like it, keep going and going and going. Much like Pantera from last year, I would challenge you to really listen to some of the lyrics, because despite the fact that the singing is not totally there, nor is the instrumentation all the time, the lyrics are great. And I do think that the lyrics do bring up deep emotional issues like Pantera did last year. So I would just encourage you to pay attention a little bit to those lyrics, because they do give you something. I mean, there's a reason that Korn is so popular. They do give the audience something. So that's something, at least to me in my estimation, is the lyric side. So give those lyrics a real thoughtful listen, or if you need to, turn on the lyrics on Spotify if that's where you're listening to it, because there's some pretty good stuff in there. So I wouldn't count them out in that regard. But like I said, despite all of that, the influence and the impact is clear. So if nothing else, for your pure education, just so we can move towards the next thing. But I think we could at least appreciate Korn a little bit while we're sitting here trying to absorb their perspective. So next is Nas Illmatic. This is a pretty fundamental foundational album from the history of rap music. It's second wave gangster rap on the East Coast side. The tracks to call out: New York State of Mind, which is a huge, huge hit. Life's a Bee, you can fill in the rest, also a huge hit. The World Is Yours, another huge hit. And Halftime, which is a pretty big hit in its own right. So this is very, very second wave. So despite the fact that Nas was not part of the Wu-Tang Clan, he still had a very distinctive voice, was very much following the second wave of East Coast gangster rap, which was taking that alt rap idea that had happened previously and merging it with gangster rap, just like how Wu-Tang did, and bringing us to this moment right here. This to me seems like, if you strip away the Wu-Tang styling and color to it, this really shows you very clearly how alt rap and gangster rap were put together into this new different thing that is that second wave of gangster rap. This whole album is amazing. His creativity, his genius is palpable here. It's amazing that he by himself can have such a strong voice compared to Wu-Tang. And obviously we haven't gotten to Biggie yet, but he's kind of in that same realm of just, he was able to have a distinctive voice and not be in the Wu-Tang Clan idea and still find amazing success. And at the same time that Wu-Tang was doing their thing, Illmatic became historically considered to be one of the most important rap albums that ever has been. So if you're not familiar with Nas's Illmatic, then you should definitely go give it a listen. It's a very, very well edited album. There's almost no wasted space in it, which is a huge thing for me. As I said about Dookie, I usually just sit and listen to this whole album end to end. That's just my preference. But these 4 tracks should give you a really good sense of what's going on in this record. And if you like this, the rest of it gives you about the same sort of vibe. So if you like it, go enjoy it, because Illmatic is fundamental. So next is Outkast with a K, Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music. All one word, and music is spelled with a K also. And also playalistic isn't a word. This is Southern rap, or more specifically, Atlanta rap. The tracks that I'll call out: Ain't No Thang, Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music, the track, Players Ball, and Get Up, Get Out. So we're finally at Southern rap. We're finally at literally anything else besides California style West Coast rap and New York style East Coast rap into a different thing. We're in Atlanta. And if you're a big fan of rap these days, Atlanta's been a thing for a really long time, probably at this point on par with Southern California or New York in some people's minds, right? Atlanta is the third big giant place. So in many respects, it started right here with Outkast making Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music. At this early stage, though, before Atlanta rap had really become its own idea, its own thing, and Outkast and Goody Mob together had found enough of a voice and a platform that other Atlanta acts could start to offshoot of that, and Atlanta/Southern rap could turn into its own thing. Outkast was primarily sounding like an amalgamation of existing artists. So there's a lot of Cypress Hill influence in there, there's a little bit of Snoop Dogg in there, and there's some Wu-Tang in there. So I would say it's probably 65% West Coast ideas, 35% East Coast ideas, and you put those together and that's what makes this record. Like that laid back lax style, smoking weed and things like that, that Cypress Hill Snoop Dogg idea, that's a lot of what's happening here. And the laid backness and being chill and stuff, that was very much the main vibe. And then there's a little bit of that hardcore mindset of the East Coast side that's adding a little bit of edge to what they're rapping about. So if you put those together, that's approximately what you make the early iteration of Southern rap. One thing I'll call out too is that considering that Outkast and Goody Mob were very tightly, closely working together for a lot of the early age of Atlanta rap. Goody Mob is on Get Up, Get Out. You may or may not know from Goody Mob that CeeLo Green was one part of Goody Mob before he became Gnarls Barkley and then eventually became CeeLo Green. So if you're listening to Get Up, Get Out and say, doesn't that sound like CeeLo? And it's definitely him. Yep. He's actually woven throughout a lot of these tracks. And there's another couple tracks too that he's on this record too. So if you want to listen to early CeeLo and hear what he was doing at that time, give this record a listen. Also, I'm sure that there's a metric ton of people out there that mostly know Outkast from only Speakerboxxx and The Love Below into the future, and they probably were not acutely aware of the first 4 amazing albums that they came out with before then, to include this one. Speakerboxxx and The Love Below was an unbelievably adventurous album that was them just stretching out their creativity as much as they possibly could in that moment. They'd been incrementally getting to that moment, but was a far cry from where they are in this moment, which is more just straight ahead gangster rap and really trying to establish Atlanta rap, Southern rap in this moment. Southern Playlist of Cadillac Music, the track is one of my favorites from the year, probably one of my favorites from the decade. Ain't No Thing is just fundamental from them, and Players Ball is too. So give those 4 tracks a listen if you like those 4. The rest of it's got that same vibe to it. Now that you've got that 65-35 split in your head about what to expect, the rest of it's about like this. It's really great stuff. Early Outkast, so great, so amazing, so creative. Such a great counterpoint to West Coast, East Coast in this moment, especially because in 93 to 95, they were really fighting with each other a whole bunch and trying to one-up one another. The fact that Atlanta rap was just out here lounging while the whole rap scene was burning down was kind of an interesting thing to witness. So this is a nice respite from the East Coast, West Coast back and forth. So next is Pavement, Crooked Rain, Crooked Rain. This is third wave alt rock. I might even say that it's leaning into indie rock, and we'll talk about why here in a second. So the tracks, Stop Breathing, Cut Your Hair, which is their big breakthrough hit finally, Gold Sounds, and Range Life. First of all, I'll call out Buddy Holly, because Stop Breathing is essentially just Every Day by Buddy Holly, which is really funny. It gives me a sense too that for whatever reason, they had this perception that by utilizing old school rock and roll like Buddy Holly to create some degree of intonation, harmony in their music. It's funny that that's how that decided to happen. I'm not totally sure exactly why that was important for them. Maybe they had gone so far into being counterculture and not caring that they thought, you know what, it would actually be unexpected and subvert expectations if we sounded in tune for once. Maybe that's funny. And they were right in a way. I think that they accidentally stumbled upon finding the way forward for alternative rock into the future of being indie rock. But either way, Cut Your Hair was on the radio, probably more so than any of their other tracks, past, present, future, by orders of magnitude. And it's funny too, because listening to Cut Your Hair, I'm sure that for people that in no way were exposed to Pavement and they heard that song and they thought, why are they so bad at singing or playing their instruments in tune, and just weren't familiar with Pavement? And then in that similar vein, you hear that Cut Your Hair song and think, oh yeah, I'm totally into this, whatever this is. And then you listen to the rest of the record and go, whoa, this sounds nothing like the rest of this. And then you go back and listen to Slanted and Enchanted and go, whoa, this is really out there stuff. It's just funny, especially because unless you had heard Pixies beforehand and this and that, going back into the past, Pavement might have just sounded like a totally out there band that just was making up weird stuff as they were going along, and you couldn't even really track it in your mind. It's funny to imagine people going on that backwards journey, discovering Pavement and then going backwards even further and discovering Pixies and going back even further and trying to figure out where all of this came from in that direction, which might have been probably hard back in 1994. It's a lot easier these days. But like I said, there's a lot of Buddy Holly that's easing up some of the edginess, the lackadaisical slackerdom that's happening in historic Pixies that is influencing this into indie rock music. And then obviously there's a lot of that Daniel Johnston sort of thing going on, at least from this year, where There's a little bit of that off kilter going on, but it's also kind of in tune and a little bit melodic. So that's why we're going in those indie rock directions. But if you like this, the rest of it, I think at this point we're familiar with what Pavement offers. So this to me should sound much more accessible than Slanted and Enchanted was. So if you like where they're going, listen to the rest of it, because I guarantee you this is about 1/2 second away from being indie rock. And if indie rock's your thing, then this should be a 1/2 second before it hits indie rock. So give it a listen. Next is Pearl Jam Vitalogy. This is neo-roots rock like we've been talking about. It's also that influence off of first wave alt rock from Husker Du. The tracks I'll call out specifically about connecting to Husker Du is Spin the Black Circle, which basically sounds like New Day Rising by Husker Du. They sound 80% in sync with each other. And then Last Exit is the other track that I call out. So as I was going through this project originally, I didn't really understand why or how those connection points happen between the retro roots rock movement figuring out neo roots rock. Like I didn't really make that connection, but as I've intensively gone through and listened to this music as part of the podcast, I did put it together and say, oh, this just sounds like Husker Du. Weird. Okay. Which was an interesting thing for me because as I've been listening to my big list trying to tease out my essentials, there haven't been a lot of rock bands that have come forward that really tried to pull forward what Husker Du was trying to do. And so the fact that Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam, what have you, and then everybody that's kind of in that same idea sphere, like Bush, etc., realized that they could take their retro roots ideas and link it up with the really hard driving guitars that were coming out of Husker Du 7-8 years ago makes this new thing that you could technically call alt rock now, because at least it's getting semi-influenced from first wave alternative rock at this point. It's really interesting stuff that, at least by my view, nobody was using Husker Du's influences until several years later. I would say that REM had their moment in the sun influencing other bands to get further along in a lot of different offshoots of rock music and got us to second wave alt rock. But Husker Du was always flying a little bit under the radar. And then all of a sudden, like 6, 7, 8 years later, their sound just suddenly pops back out onto the scene with albums like Vitalogy or like 16 Stone, or for the most part, what we consider to be the sound in quote alt rock or neo roots rock for the next several years. It's just interesting stuff. Like they all simultaneously rediscovered Husker Du and wanted to collectively move some of those artifacts into their music. It's really interesting, cool stuff. So if you like Last Exit and Spin the Black Circle, give another track a listen and then another track. I would say I pulled the two most important tracks out from the record, but it's all pretty good. I mean, especially because they do Husker Du justice here by pulling forward some of their great ideas. So give the rest of it a listen. And if you've been waiting for Vitalogy, then here we are, right? This is Pearl Jam's next evolutionary moment. So next is Portishead Dummy. This is trip hop, definitely, and dream pop to a certain extent. One thing I'll call out before I get to the tracks is that this, besides the Judy and Mary album, was one of organically also the first albums that I ever came upon and fell in love with immediately. Again, I didn't understand why, didn't understand how it connected back to anything. I didn't know anything about hip hop or rap or electronica to any meaningful extent back in 1994, but stumbled upon this album somehow, some way, and it like changed my entire understanding of what music is. So I have a huge bias coming into this one, but it's not because it's not great, because it is amazing as an album and totally influential, totally groundbreaking, but it legitimately is one of my favorite albums ever. So calling out the bias where it exists. The tracks I'll call out: Mysterons, Strangers, Roads, and then Glory Box, which is our first example of using Walk On By. Super weird. Well, I think actually in this context, the reason that Walk On By was used was because the nature of the song, what Beth Gibbons is singing about in Glory Box, can tangentially align to some ideas that are elicited in Walk On By. So they have some indirect connection points to each other. So I'm sure it was used with intentionality. And I'm sure that the next example that we have here coming up in a second also was done with intentionality. I'm not totally sure why it was hitting people, but it was, and there it is. One thing I'll say about this record, other than that I'm in a love affair with this record, Glory Box to me is one of the best tracks that exists from the 90s, period, is that this is a clear bridge from trip hop and dream pop more towards indie pop and indie rock. The affectations are very noticeable and very distinctive, but the rest of it is starting to go away from dream pop seeming as dreamy, and this is a little bit more deep, thick, sludgy, not necessarily a nightmare, but it's not nearly as much of a dream as the dream pop of several years ago was. This is darker and deeper, and it's going in indie pop directions for sure. So Portishead is pushing the genre along 100%. They're not necessarily doing anything new and innovative on the trip hop side. It's still taking all of those typical artifacts of like jazzy sounds, jazzy singing, on top of rap, making it sound a little bit old school in how they produced it. So all of those artifacts have been around for a couple of years at this point. So they're not doing anything new there, but they are pushing a lot of it towards more indie pop artifacts to come in the late 90s, early 2000s, absolutely. And I'll tell you this much, that Portishead in this moment on Dummy is influencing other bands in the trip hop and indie pop scenes to come. So they are clearly utilizing some artifacts found here, either on Mysterons or Rhodes or Glory Box, Strangers to a lesser extent, but at the very least those, bringing those ideas forward into indie pop. If you like what's going on in these 4 tracks, this is another one of those albums where I'll just listen to it end to end and I won't really break up or distinguish between individual tracks because it's, to me, a singular experience. They're all distinctive songs talking about different things slightly, but it's one entire vibe put together in an album. And so if you like these 4 tracks, maybe start at the beginning with Mysterons and go all the way forward, because the album ends with Glory Box. So you're getting a really good sense of the album here with these 4 tracks. But if you want to detect and understand all the in-between pieces, give the whole thing a listen because it's all about this great. So next is the Notorious B.I.G. Ready to Die. This is second wave gangster rap on the East Coast side. Do I need to tell you that? Maybe. For rap fans, this is pretty obvious stuff, but for people that are new to Biggie, it's second wave East Coast gangster rap. The tracks I'm going to call out: Warning, which is the other Walk On By reference, Juicy, Big Papa, and Who Shot Ya? So much like Nas, I talked about a bit ago, Biggie is somehow, some way managing to step way out beyond Wu-Tang and by himself become an absolute paragon of rap excellence all in one shot. After this, there isn't much because he dies pretty soon after this. And so there really isn't a lot more coming out from Biggie at this point unless he's resurrected like a zombie to be thrown into other people's tracks after his death, which you could probably tell by my saying that I don't enjoy that that's how that happened. The one thing I'll really say, besides the fact that he really does stand on his own aside from the Wu-Tang Clan, which is amazing in and of itself, like Nas, that I believe he is the true evolution from Public Enemy and NWA style first wave gangster rap. There's not really a lot of alt rap going on here, but it's definitely distinctive compared to Public Enemy and NWA. And so it is gangster rap, but it sounds so much purer. It sounds truer as a true evolution off of what they were doing versus incorporating any semblance of alt rap into what it is that he's doing, like Big Papa, for example, or Juicy. Neither of those inherently sound like alt rap in any respect. Like, he is fully committed to gangster rap ideas and he's leaning all the way into it, but still honoring what we did before with Public Enemy and NWA 100%. He's a purist in that regard, and he's doing it with confidence without having to incorporate any of those other alt-rap things into it in order to make it more widely accessible. He's just doing it straight up, and he's accomplishing it fully. The last thing I'll call out is the track Who Shot Ya? So it actually almost sounds a little bit like G-Funk, which is interesting to me because, again, not having any of the context, I mean, I do know that the East Coast and West Coast were at war with each other around this time. So I'm not 100% sure if he was doing that as a means to prod or poke at or instigate the West Coast side by sounding a little bit G-Funk, or he was legitimately sharing some of that inspiration and creativity. I'm sure that people who are bigger experts on this era of rap music could set me straight. But it's interesting that that connection point does exist because from my uneducated perspective, I can't tell if it's a collaborative, creative idea or he is doing it on purpose in order to be provocative. I'm not totally sure. But either way, that connection does exist. It's interesting stuff. So if you like these 4 tracks, the rest of it is pretty amazing. I mean, Ready to Die is fundamental as fundamental gets for especially this era of rap music. So give Biggie your love. I mean, people have been giving Biggie love for ever and ever and ever and ever at this point, but why not join in on it? Because Ready to Die is an amazing album that spotlighted one of the best in gangster rap that ever has been, or probably ever will be. So next is The Offspring, Smash. This is neo-punk as opposed to pop punk or just punk. This is also grunge and a little bit speed metal. So we talked about in the punk section earlier in the episode how pop punk was so completely taking over the conversation around punk, which has been incrementally taking over the conversation for a while now, right? Where Bad Religion and Social Distortion and bands like that were starting to move punk in a much softer, more accessible, poppier direction. And Dookie was just the next iteration of pushing it even further into pop directions and doing it with such gusto that it consumed the entire conversation. So juxtaposed to that, it inadvertently created a counterculture to the counterculture of punk and created what I call neopunk. The Offspring does a really good job of embodying that, not necessarily because they're straight ahead punk purists, because tracks like Gotta Get Away and Self-Esteem do have pop hooks to them. It's not like they don't, but it's much more dedicated to original punk ideals that one could argue are different than what Green Day and Dookie were putting out. So that's why I call it neopunk. There is also a fair bit of grunge going on in there, like Nirvana style grunge. There's also Metallica style speed metal going in there, like old Metallica. So if you put old Metallica and Bad Religion and Nirvana together, you basically get what this is. And it creates that next true wave of punk music, at least in the United States, which we're calling neopunk. The tracks, like I said, Gotta Get Away, Come Out and Play, and Self-Esteem. Self-Esteem and Gotta Get Away are their two initial huge hits before they become even more poppy when they come out with their next record. But at least in this moment, they still have a lot of old speed metal influences and a lot of Nirvana style grunge and also Nirvana style alt metal thing going on that Nirvana played with Bleach and then also with In Utero. So there's a lot going on here in this record. Offspring is really great insofar as they pull together a lot of current ideas to make some new approaches and put a juxtaposed face on punk other than what Green Day is essentially consuming in this moment with Dookie. So it's a great juxtaposition. If you like these three tracks, it all kind of goes in the same direction. It's all neopunk, speed metal, grunge sort of concept. I think their perspective is a little bit fragmented, so it's not all one thing just yet. I think they're still playing with a few different things, but I think they execute all of them pretty darn well. So because of that, even if you hit a track that doesn't necessarily line up in terms of its vision to the rest of these, it's probably still going to be pretty good. So you can usually count on The Offspring to deliver quality. So give the rest of the album a listen if you like it. Next is The Prodigy, Music for the Jilted Generation. This is techno, electronic dance music. The tracks I'll call out: Break and Enter, Voodoo People, and No Good. So there's a couple things that I want to talk about regarding The Prodigy in this record as an evolution off of Experience by The Prodigy, which was a couple years ago. First of all, Voodoo People is about as close to pop music in techno as I think we've seen thus far. And I'm not just saying that because it was on the Hackers soundtrack and it probably influenced a whole counterculture generation of people just based upon that track, and it elicits something in their mind and in their hearts. It's so self-contained and it's so tight. It really seems like a pop track, even though it's completely derived from techno music, which is really interesting because it's showing how artists are starting to figure out how to use electronica in order to create just more straight ahead pop music that can be on the radio or can be used in movies in this case or TV shows and hit a wider audience. So where house music was finding that balance between being in the club, being on the radio, listening to it at home several years ago, tracks like this and records like this are having DJs and electronic artists figuring out how techno can do the same thing. So Voodoo People was a really great way to ground potential DJs and electronic artists on where do they take this stuff. They take it in this direction if they want to make more pop hits. The other thing I'll say is that The Prodigy does such an excellent job building their songs. So Break and Enter, for example, which is like an 8+ minute song, which may not be for everybody, but I would encourage you to just listen to it. Just sit down and listen to at least the first half of it. And the reason that I say this is that track is so much of what I like about really great electronica, which is it's fine dining, where it's the continuous building of flavors and artifacts and removing and adding them at just the right times in order to eventually cascade into this highly complex song that's got all of these different interesting things going on at once. And it really gives you this highly complex art to absorb, much like if you were going to eat fine dining where they build all these flavors and this is infused with that and that adds to that and this texture and that texture mixed together and you put this with this and this and it makes just these really complex things, and maybe there's like a wine pairing and it's very complex stuff. And Break and Enter in this case, it takes a couple sounds, a couple artifacts and lets you get used to them. and then they pull in another thing, and then they pull in another thing, and then they drop a couple things for a little while, and they pull more different stuff in, or maybe they turn a right corner and build up 3 or 4 more new things, and then they take the old stuff and bring it in with the new stuff, and then they add another thing, and it keeps building and building and building and building until you get the whole idea, the whole concept, the whole vision, and it's just amazing to witness and listen to. No Good is like that too, and Voodoo People to a lesser extent because it is more of a pop track, but it does do a similar thing. And a lot of electronic artists have been doing this before The Prodigy. The Prodigy in this case is just putting it in a spotlight, putting it on a pedestal for us all to enjoy and feel the rapture. It's really amazing stuff. So like I said, despite the fact that Break and Enter is like an 8-minute song, give it a listen just so you can get a sense for what I'm talking about here, because this to me is the highest of high quality MCing and DJing, where they are taking you on that artistic journey or creative journey through their vision, increment by increment, until you get the whole picture and you're just sort of living in the moment. It's really amazing stuff. And if you want something that's a little bit lower of a lift, Voodoo People is a much more palatable version of what I'm talking about in Break and Enter, because it is more popish. They do a similar thing. It's not as complex as Break and Enter, but it still gives you the vibe if you don't want to go on the 8-minute journey. So if you like all this, it's all about the same in this record. I think it's a little bit more fragmented into individual tracks than the previous record was by them, Experience by The Prodigy. So you're not necessarily as tethered to listening to the whole multi-track experience for them. In this case, you can listen to individual tracks and get the flavors. So if you like these 3 tracks, go check out some of the other ones, because they all build those complex flavors, and most of them, like The Prodigy, is really good at doing. So next is TLC Crazy Sexy Cool. This is R&B girl group music. The tracks I'll call out, which should be pretty obvious to anybody that was alive and listening to music in the 90s, Creep, Digging on You, and Waterfalls. All 3 tracks were on the radio continuously, probably on top of each other, on different radio stations at the same time. You could find any one of the 3 of these multiple times every hour for quite a long time. So very, very popular tracks, very popular. One thing I'll say about this is that nothing that they're doing in this record is inherently new. I think that they're taking a lot of what already existed and refining it and polishing things up a lot more and putting it into just a nicer, more confident package, which is a thing that has tended to happen over the course of our music journey here so far, where bands pull together a bunch of stuff that already existed that wasn't particularly high of a lift, and then shoving it together in a nice package, polishing it up real clean so it seems like one cohesive thing, and then putting it forward. It's not necessarily like Nirvana's Nevermind, because there's about 12% of the complexity in it that they were pulling together from various different influences, but it's one of the best examples of R&B girl group music that we've had so far in this music journey. It's really confident. The perspective is really, really clear. The messages are really clear too. They're highly relatable to a wide variety of people, like a wide audience, demographics, irrespective. It's highly translatable pop music, but it does still have that R&B girl group vibe to it. Like, it's definitely got R&B elements to it that are distinguishable from, let's just say, Britney Spears or Christina Aguilera. Like, this is definitely R&B music. We haven't ventured out of the R&B era of girl groups just yet, so we're still living in it and really enjoying all of the material that TLC is putting out. I mean, Creep, Digging on You, and Waterfalls are 3 monster hits for them. The rest of the album is about like this. Those are the 3 standout hits though, so if you start crawling around Crazy Sexy Cool and not seeing a lot of the same quality, yeah, it is what it is. It's still really good. Those 3 tracks are a pinnacle though. But if you like these 3 and you haven't listened to Crazy Sexy Cool ever, or you haven't listened to it for a while and you want to get back into your 90s moment, then go listen to it. It's really great. Really great stuff. And finally is Weezer by Weezer, or the Blue Album, depending on what you designate it at, but it's their first album. I'm just calling this indie rock. I'm not even calling it third wave alternative rock, even though technically it is derived from third wave alternative rock. It is definitely much more indie rock than it is third wave. And I'll tell you why here in a second. So the tracks I'll call out, and these are 4 tracks that I like a lot, but really the whole album is excellent, and you could listen to just about the whole thing, and there's just hits. So Buddy Holly, Say It Ain't So, Holiday, and Only in Dreams. All 4 are distinctive from one another. They go on different journeys. It gives you a really good sense for where Weezer is at, and also where indie rock is going to go over the next 10 years, and also where it came from with third wave alt rock. So interestingly enough, where Crooked Rain is just starting to play with the idea of being in tune but being third wave alt rock, Weezer and Rivers Cuomo is just jumping right into saying we're going to be doing in tune third wave alt rock and just leaping right past what Pavement is doing into this new different thing. And as a result, we're calling it indie rock. because it basically is indie rock. It was just a matter of time before somebody realized that you could take what Slanted and Enchanted was doing and then just put it in tune, and it becomes this even more pleasing, accessible thing for people. You're just making Pavement more poppy, and you're getting this. So that's basically it. And as a result, since they're leaping out past Pavement, which was already on the forefront of doing alt rock, now with Weezer doing indie rock, they're out in front on West Coast rock music. Aside from what's going on with the neo-roots rock grunge thing that's happening, like the indie rock movement, which we know is going to be over the next 10 years, starts here in 1994 with the Blue Album by Weezer. And it sets the tone for so much, not just the indie rock hipster persona, which is an evolution off of the alt rock persona. And it's giving an exact roadmap with songs like Buddy Holly, with Undone. It's giving a roadmap to those listener groups and cultures of what sort of personality and persona they're supposed to embody. They give them the roadmap right then and there. They're supposed to be a little bit nerdy. They're supposed to be a little bit understated, but also pretty alt rock at the same time. But you dress differently than you would have if you were listening to grunge music. Like, it's very distinctive persona. Whenever we think of hipsters, we think of Weezer, right? So because of that, they're starting this all with 1994, and we're calling it indie rock. So those 4 tracks, if you like them, give the rest a listen, because the whole rest of the record is awesome like this. It gives you that indie rock flavor. Honestly, this is another one of those where you could listen to the whole thing end to end and you won't break a sweat. So it's really great stuff. Weezer is fantastic, especially in these early days where they have all the perspective and they've got all the wind in their sails carrying them into the future. So if you're not familiar with Weezer, then give this record your love, because it'll really give you a good understanding of who they are and where indie rock is going over the next decade. So next, let's talk about our conspicuous absences and why. So first is Dave Matthews Band, Under the Table and Dreaming. So we talked about this when we were talking about Hootie and the Blowfish, that I, at least back in the day, struggled to differentiate between Hootie and the Blowfish and Dave Matthews Band. So one of the main reasons was because both of them came out with hugely influential and important and meaningful and popular albums this year. So it's hard to differentiate the two. The reason that this is on the conspicuous absences and Hootie and the Blowfish is on the essentials is that Dave Matthews Band, while I honor that they are taking the Pearl Jam sound and adding more pop into it so that it's even more poppy than anything that we've talked about so far, turning Pearl Jam ideas and retro roots rock ideas into pop music, they do that more so than anybody ever probably will. Or at least in this moment they did, because I would consider them to be the pop version of whatever in quote alt rock is and was created by Pearl Jam's 10. But having said that, where Hootie and the Blowfish is infusing R&B elements into their music to create greater melodies, greater harmonies, and eliciting greater emotions in their music, this to me is pushing no boundaries. Basically, like, other than the fact that they're making it more poppy, which really isn't pushing a boundary, it's making it less dynamic and less creative by comparison. Not any shade on Dave Matthews Band in this case, because they're wildly successful, right? Nobody would argue that they're not wildly successful and also wildly influential, but they don't push any boundaries. So as a result, conspicuous absence. It's a meaningful record to say the least, but not essential. Not really. Next is Jamiroquai, The Return of the Space Cowboy. This is their first record. It's acid jazz. In case you're not familiar with Jamiroquai, they are technically classified as acid jazz, which is jazz in its own way, crooner to a certain extent, and then as they evolve, acid jazz and their sounds continues to evolve and go more in disco-y directions, but for right now, they're more strictly sticking in nightclub-style jazz, with a little bit of flavor added to it, which is why it's acid jazz and not just straight-ahead jazz. Like I said, it's their first record. I really like Jamiroquai, so I'm a little bit biased on this. The thing I'll say, though, putting that aside, and also putting aside the fact that I know where they're going to go, even in their next record from now, it sounds, listening to this record, that it's about 30% of what I presume that they can do. Like, they're playing with some ideas that are interesting. And J.K., the lead singer of Jamiroquai, has a really great distinctive voice, and I love him for it. But I think that they only realized a fraction what I heard as potential in this record. Like, there's an unbelievable amount of potential coming out of this record. And again, not because I've heard all the rest of what I've heard of them going up to even their current day stuff, but because you just listen to this record. Like, you yourself could even go into my big list and listen to The Return of the Space Cowboy and hear that they're doing a lot of interesting things and there is some potential there, but they don't really get out of first gear for most of this stuff. Like, once they start to take it to great heights, then it really starts to expand and get even better and really make better use of JK's voice. But in this moment, no, not yet. It's not ready yet. Next is Keiichi Suzuki, Hirokazu Tanaka, Hiroshi Kanazu, and Toshiyuki Ueno, and they made the Earthbound original soundtrack. This is second-gen video game music. In Japan, it is also known as Mother 2. It is part of the Mother franchise of games, so there's Mother on the Nintendo, Mother 2 on the Super Nintendo, and so forth. But in the Western world, we call it Earthbound. So this record is unbelievable. It's an unbelievable soundtrack. It's insanely ambitious. It's incredibly self-effacing. Like, it is a total juxtaposition and counter to all traditional Japanese role-playing games that have existed up until this moment. So you're thinking about Final Fantasy games and things of that nature. This is a total juxtaposition to that, mostly tongue-in-cheek, making fun of those games and how overly serious they are. This game is extremely non-serious, unserious, some might say. But the amazing thing is that as time goes on, it becomes progressively more serious, which all good stories should become. They should start off wacky and ridiculous and progressively become more serious if you're going on a hero's journey, which they are, because it is a role-playing game. And the music does shift and change. Two, the world that this game takes place in is like the regular everyday world that we live in. And it's not in a fantastical, like Lord of the Rings style fantasy world like most Final Fantasies are. This is taking place like every day. Like instead of a sword, the main character has a baseball bat. And instead of having a bow and arrow, one of the characters has like a pop gun. They thought about these things, trying to make it current and relatable to everyday people. And it's just a really ambitious, highly creative game that has a highly ambitious and creative soundtrack that goes with it. The main reason that it's not on our essentials, beyond the fact that this was a really tight year, is that unfortunately there's a little bit too many throwaway songs on this album that takes away from the, I would say, 10 to 15 tracks that are really, 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 really excellent. Some of the best that's ever happened in video games up until this moment. But it's a really long soundtrack, which can be good because there's a lot of variety in the experiences that you have as a player. But there's a lot of throwaway songs that are a little bit too tongue-in-cheek or a little bit too self-effacing, and so it distracts a little bit from the really, really high-quality creative stuff. It's all creative, but some of it's creative kitsch, and some of it's just genuinely creative. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in that regard. But if you're interested in the soundtrack, you can go onto YouTube and listen to it if you'd like, or you can go find the game and play it yourself, because it is a really excellent game and continues to be one of the most innovative role-playing video games that has ever existed, even till today. 30 plus years on, it's still one of the most innovative that has ever existed. So give it a listen, give it a play if you're interested. It's really fun stuff, but conspicuous absence. Next is Soundgarden, Super Unknown. This is neo-roots rock and grunge rock, like we've been talking about this whole entire episode. Soundgarden is just bringing even more of that. The main associations you can give, it's a little bit like Pearl Jam again, and current Metallica. So like Metallica from a few years ago, not historic Metallica, but current stuff. Putting those two things together, and that's basically what you get. It's not quite as hard as Korn, so it's a little bit eased up compared to that. It's good. It's not like it's not a good album. It's one of their best that they came out with. But to me, listening to it, Black Hole Sun, which is on this record, is basically the only killer track, and everything else is kind of in the middle, not as impactful or meaningful as Black Hole Sun was, or as good. They clearly got a lot of mileage out of that song. The music video is really great. It's definitely very irreverent and hits the vibe of 1994 perfectly. A lot of people probably think of Black Hole Sun when they think about early 90s, in quote, alternative rock. So it is a good track, but the rest of it, to me, a little bit throwaway. Sorry, fans of this album or Soundgarden, I apologize, but I really tried to listen to it and get more out of it than Black Hole Sun, and I really just couldn't, so I'm sorry. And finally, Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima, again, like from a couple of years ago, and this is the Streets of Rage 3 original soundtrack. This is also second-gen video game music, just like the Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack was. So the reason that this is on our conspicuous absences, which is a shock because Streets of Rage 2 was very firmly in our essential list from a year or two ago, is that despite the fact that this is probably the most ambitious video game music of all time, it is also very hard to grasp. It's not scary, it's just a little bit inaccessible. To a degree that where I said from the 1992 episode, talking about the Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack, how some of those tracks, it was pretty surprising that the game producers let those tracks in because they can distract a little bit from the game itself, like Spin on the Bridge, for example. That track is so all-encompassing in your awareness and senses that it can pull you out of playing the game itself and and be distracting, which isn't so great when you're playing a video game that the music is so sensorily engaging that you're losing track of actually playing the game itself. Like, the track is amazing. It's really fantastic, super ambitious. The problem is, like, 90% of the Streets of Rage 3 soundtrack is that level of engaging turned up by like 10 orders of magnitude, and they're all like that. So because of that, is it super ambitious electronica music? 100%. Nobody could deny that it's hyper ambitious, and it is really, really creative, and it is some of the most ambitious video game music that has ever been printed on a cartridge or a disc. But also, it's really hard to listen to. I would encourage you to go into my big list and listen to even the first meaningful track on this soundtrack and just listen to that and go, wow, how did the game developers let this soundtrack get into the game? I can't even really listen to this properly. Like, how am I supposed to pay attention to the game while I'm listening to this at the same time? I feel like I almost have to either listen to the music really intently or play the game. I can't do both at the same time. So because of that, I honor that it is deeply, deeply ambitious, and I honor Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima endlessly for their ambition. But at the same time, it's really, really hard to get into the soundtrack just because of how aggressive it is in its styling and production. So, conspicuous absence. But having said that, what did you agree with? Did you agree? Did you agree in this year that Weezer started all of indie rock? Did you disagree with that? Maybe. Did you disagree that I should have put Soundgarden on the essentials and not put them on the conspicuous absences and knocked something else off? Did you agree that Pavement basically was just starting to play with some of those ideas that Weezer leapt out in front and took hold of, or that Husker Du has been influential for a bunch of these bands up until this whole moment and I'm only personally becoming aware of it just now? Would you, after having listened to Dookie and JAM, agree that they are mirrors of each other coming out with similar movements at the same time in different parts of the world, or disagree with that? Did you disagree that All For One is beyond I Swear? I don't really know. Or that everybody was really paying attention to Boyz II Men in this moment and not in a later iteration. So what did I miss? Did I miss anything? Probably. I mean, as these years are going along, I have to leave out more and more and more and more records. I mean, there was 87 albums that were in my big list for this year, and it's only going to keep going up for the next several years. So the likelihood that I'm going to be missing something is pretty high. What did you learn this year? Did you learn something beyond what I told you about Judy and Mary, or a new appreciation for Hootie and the Blowfish, or us returning to Daniel Johnston, or was that Husker Du influence thing totally new to you? Hopefully you're learning something. I mean, we're getting in deep into some of this 90s material, and so hopefully you're learning a fair bit as we're going along here. So before we get going, I just want to remind that if you are interested in listening to any of the music that I referenced in today's episode, feel free to check out our Essential playlist. As well, if you want to listen to the whole albums or the conspicuous absences or any of the other music that I kept from 1994, check out my big list, both of which are linked in the description of this episode. Please join us again. Please make sure to rate us and comment. I think that we have a lot of really great fans out there that have been pretty diligent in rating us and commenting, but in case you haven't yet, make sure that you go in and rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us, and comment on all of our posts on Instagram. You can find us at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the episodes that we have coming out every Tuesday. And as well, if we do any further interviews with any artists, those come out on random Thursday. So make sure you just subscribe so you don't miss any of that. Make sure to tell everybody you know, everybody you don't know, because we're working here to create a community around listening to all of this music thoughtfully and fearlessly. And so being able to bring even more people into the discussion to get their perspectives, their thoughts, their feelings about all of this will only make our experience that much better and fuller. So make sure you're telling everybody. And two, let's not forget that the only real way that we can be engaging and having these knockdown, drag-out fights with each other and conversations and arguments and sharing about our experiences with any of this music that we're either coming upon now fresh or reminiscing about and coming to in a retro sort of way, the only way we can engage with any of this stuff and have these conversations is if we're, as I said, going into this music fearlessly. And the only real way that we can overcome that worry, concern, trepidation, or potential self-judgment about listening to any of this music is realizing that none of it is scary. It's just music. Right? Thanks for listening.